Welcome. I'm Patricia Cranzi, Executive Director of the Overseas Press Club of America. Um, we are delighted tonight to host a book night with veteran journalist Peter Osnos to discuss his memoir, An Especially Good View, Watching History Happen. John Darnton, a New York Times journalist who worked there over 40 years and won a Pulitzer-prize and is also a novelist. He will lead the discussion and give us much more information about Peter, and they will discuss the book for about half an hour, and then we will open it up to questions. You can put your questions in the chat or raise your hand on Zoom, and we will see them. So I turn it over to you, John. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patricia. Reporter, foreign correspondent, editor, columnist, publisher. When it comes to the written word, Peter Osnos has done it all. And now he's a memoirist, looking back over a career that spans some 50 years and has made for encounters with an endless number of prominent people, ranging from Robert McNamara, Tip O'Neill, Vernon Jordan, Boris Yeltsin, George Soros, Magic Johnson, not to mention 4 presidents whose books he worked on closely. This book of his, as Patricia said, is called An Especially Good View, Watching History Happen. Peter, I'm glad to have the chance to talk with you. And I would like to begin at the beginning, even before the beginning, before you were born. As you relate in the book, your family had to flee from Warsaw when the Nazis invaded. They embarked on a perilous, basically 5-year journey of detours and dead ends and frantic searches for visas. You yourself were born on the way in Bombay, and you ended up arriving in the California coast in a basket with your mother and father and older brother, and finally made their way to New York City. So my question to you is, I have a sense that this beginning has been a shadow over much of your life. Can you tell me how this shaped you, and especially how it helped you become a journalist?
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you to OPC, Patricia, and just so everybody knows that this Darnton fellow and I are very close friends. So beat me up, he's not going to. If anybody has savage, well, we'll see. I don't know if you are on that again, but we are really close friends. So this isn't this is kind of a setup. But the word I would change, John, in what you just said was shadow, because it wasn't a shadow, it was a fact. And the way the whole project started was when my grandson, Benjamin, who's now 17, who lives in Northern California, Woodacre, he said, "Tell me the story of your family in World War II." And I said, "Hey, Ben, it's our family." And that sort of spurred in me the instinct to go back and essentially re-report the whole story. I call it a reported memoir because it very much required the time, energy, and skills that I had developed in decades and decades as a reporter. And that's really what it is. It's a reporter's memoir. It tells the story of everything that happened, as you said, from even before I was born, well before I was born, in a reporter's way. So in order to tell the story of Poland, for example, or India, I went to Poland with my wife, and I went to India with my wife and my grandsons. My parents lived in India for 4 years. They got there with nothing but their wits, and they made a life. And as you said, I left in a basket on a troop ship. So I had to go back in order to relive their lives and report.
Right. Got it. But this is kind of what I was wondering. I found a sentence in here in which you arrive in New York and you describe it. You say, "And so from the beginning, I was a spectator to their lives, as they adjusted to New York and the US. My life was to unfold in a place and a culture that was completely different from the one that had shaped my parents and my brother. In that sense, I was destined to be a reporter from the outset. So what is there in that upbringing and your childhood that kind of forced you to become a reporter, or that
Well,
made
as I
that
said,
decision such a natural one?
I say also that we were strangers with the same DNA, but I don't mean that as a pejorative. I don't mean that they were not interested as parents, but their lives were completely different. So my life had to be, to a very large extent, shaped and defined by what I encountered. What I encountered as a child, what I encountered as a teenager. I went away to school, boarding school when I was 14, never lived home again. And so the truth is that I had inherently, instinctively, this capacity to observe. Whereas Yogi Berra actually said, you can observe a lot by watching.
Yeah, I know, but see, that's the interesting thing. Your subtitle, if that's the right word, is
Right.
watching history happen, not making history happen. Do you think there is something about a reporter, something in the nature of a reporter, that makes him or her more of an observer than a participant?
Well, that's actually a major and very important theme, which should be of interest to the people who are in journalism on this Zoom. I call it deflection. I was in Vietnam for 2 years, in Moscow for 3. In both of those places, there were many times, certainly a number of times. In Vietnam, it was physical danger. And in Russia, in the Soviet Union, it was harassment. Yeah. When, under normal circumstances, I should have been, I don't want to use the word scared, but I should have been concerned, I should have been flustered, I should have been something. But because I had the reporter's instinct, which I think most of us have, or at least did have, that's an interesting question. But most of us who were reporters who grew up in this generation deflected. So very quick example. On the day that my editor of the time, Mr. Bradley, was scheduled to come to Vietnam, I was scheduled on the Monday morning to go on a helicopter with a Vietnamese general. Bradley was supposed to come on Tuesday. Bradley came on Monday. I didn't go with the helicopter. And when I picked up Bradley from the airport and brought him back to the office, I was told that the helicopter exploded on takeoff. Now, that's striking. But it really wasn't until 30 years later, when Ben was writing his memoirs and had a researcher call me and say, did anything happen on that trip? That I ever really went back and examined our reaction. And I called my colleague, Peter Jay, who's the other Post correspondent. I said, Peter, is it really the fact that the chopper went down, everybody was dead, and we went to lunch? And he said it was. That's deflection. Is it the right in emotional situations and is it? I don't know, but it is something that reporters do. And the exact happened in Moscow.
Did you test your courage in Vietnam? Did you worry before you went that you might not have it? Have stuff.
Now you could say that I was naive. I mean, there was a very funny moment. The first time I got into a helicopter after I'd been there a short time, with 2 young warrant officers, and it was one of these little helicopters in which I was strapped in the back and they were in the front. And we took off and we were flying along. And I said, Touchland, excuse me, but do you mind actually kind of closing the door to the chopper? I said, what, you out of your mind? If we close the door, how do we get track fire? I mean, yeah, was I pleased? No. But did I run away? No. I just think that it's all part of this process. If you're there as a reporter and believe you're there as a reporter, what they say is you don't really feel the full brunt of it if they shoot at you. If they get you, then you know. And that's the same thing that was true in Moscow. I mean, there was pretty heavy duty harassment in Moscow, particularly.
Let's talk about that. if I recall right, Catherine Graham, the owner, publisher of the Post, had received a kind of quiet word that you were going to be a target or were a target of the KGB. What happened? What form did this harassment take? And how did you get out of it? How did you avoid it?
Well, the reason I know, well, first of all, I never pursued in depth how she came to this conclusion that we were going to be the subject of a provocation, but it was real. Maynard Parker was then the managing editor of Newsweek. He was in Moscow. He said, listen, I have this message from Catherine Graham. And she thinks that she's been told that there's going to be a problem and you should probably leave. So my wife, Susan, and I took a walk around the courtyard. We consulted with a good friend who was a senior diplomat in the British Embassy, and we decided to stay. Why? Because I knew by instinct that if we left, it would be a short-term relief and a long-term regret, because they would have hounded us out. And my wife, whose family were diplomats and had been in Eastern Europe, she had a stalwart capacity that perhaps others might not have had. So we decided to stay. I never drove again from the time then on until we left. Kept my hands in my pockets.
Because they might stop you for some imaginary.
They would stage an accident. They did that in at least one other case.
Right.
They might stick something in my pocket, which they also did with Bob Toth of the LA Times. At the end of the story is, for one reason or another, they had to stop harassing me, and that's a whole nother lunch. But instead, Bob Toth, who was in his last days, just as I was, got picked up on the street, taken to Lefortovo, which is the KGB prison, and interrogated for 4 days. He was allowed to go home, but no diplomats were with him. I got somehow spared, partly, I think, because somehow I hadn't really given in, and they knew that I was leaving, and I just couldn't be a problem. I don't know, in any event. But why do I know this all happened? Because right after the fall of the Soviet Union, there was a brief period when the Politburo files were open. And a friend of mine, a Newsweek guy, Fred Coleman, found an 8-page top secret document. I have it on my wall, framed, top secret in Russian, signed by Andropov, the head of the KGB, which says that the Politburo devoted an entire meeting to what to do with Natan Sharansky, the dissident,
Right.
and Osnos, the correspondent.
Mm-hmm.
And in the case of Sharansky, he went to prison for 9 years. In the case of Osnos, they staged what they called the disaccreditatio, which they attacked me. They didn't expel me, because if they did that, they would lose a real colonel in New York.
Mm-hmm.
But if I didn't have the document and I didn't have the experience, I wouldn't have written it in the book and claimed that it in fact happened.
Right. Let me ask you a question. In, I think it was 1984, somewhere in the mid 80s, you suddenly switched professions and you made this leap from being a reporter to being a publisher. What happened there? Why did you do that? Were you disillusioned with reporting? Did you want a different kind of life? Because they're actually pretty different, as Patricia kind of indicated.
Well, what happened was that I had met in Moscow the chairman of Random House, Bob Bernstein, Robert L. Bernstein. And I gotten to know him through his visit to Moscow, his interest in human rights. We introduced him to Sakharov and Sharansky and so forth. And he said as he was leaving, look, I don't think journalism is a fit profession for a grown man. If you ever get serious, call me. And 7 years later, I did. I had had the epiphany that so many reporters have. I was sent up to Stockholm as the London correspondent, and I was standing at the Bay of Stockholm next to the UPI stringer, seeing if we could spot the Soviet submarine that was supposedly in the water. And I said, I don't know. That's an epiphany. We all have it at one time or another. Then you decide what to do. Why did I leave the Post? I loved the Post, but I really felt that in the next 10 years, I wasn't going to learn as much as I had in the last, because I had been a correspondent for a long time, and I'd been an editor, national and foreign editor. So I kind of felt that the next period would be an extension of what I already did. Whereas publishing was going to be an adventure. And remember, you asked about my parents. My parents took a whole lot of risks. And what was the influence of my parents? I guess it was, without even knowing it, the willingness to take risks. And by the way, having the right wife and partner who was willing to let me do it.
Mm-hmm. When you founded your company, well, first Random House, then your own company, Public Affairs, you cited 3 mentors. You've already named one of them, but I'd like to go back to the first one, a legendary figure, I.F. Stone. You worked for him as an assistant when you were a very young man. How did that come about? And what was the essence of what he taught you?
Well, I hope everybody watching this knows who I.F. Stone is, so I don't have to really introduce him. But as he was in the 60s and early 70s, he was what today would be called, I don't know what he'd call, blogger or Substack. He had his own weekly. And the reason he had his own weekly is because in the McCarthy era, he was branded a leftist, he couldn't get a job. So he started his own. And by the time I went to work for him, it was really established. I like to say that his first subscriber in 1953, among his first subscribers in 1953 was Albert Einstein, and later Marilyn Monroe bought subscriptions for every member of Congress. But by the time I was working there, he had about 70,000 subscribers. He was a very important voice in the anti-war, pro-civil rights movement. But what was significant about him is that he was left-wing in the sense that that was his worldview. Been to Moscow and said, I don't like these people, but he was not an anti-communist apostate. He remained what was called in the 60s kind of new left. And he always had an assistant. And I was the assistant for one publication a year, which was September to July. And my job was to be running around and helping him. And he gave me some bylines, which was really unusual for Izzy. And we became really good friends afterwards. I mean, friends. When he died, his family asked me to organize the memorial services. So what was it about his brilliant reporter? But what he taught me, I guess, and what he taught all the other people was, believe in what you're doing. Don't do it just for the money, because that's not the answer. And do it with a voice. Mm-hmm. You don't have to be shrill to be persuasive.
And you can find a lot of material in the Congressional Record and other public documents.
Right.
Now,
I mean, Izzy had an incredible memory. He could remember if he saw an item in a newspaper in June, and he wanted to know what it, and he would say, listen, can you get the item from June and match it with the item from December? And then my job to get the two items and put them together. There's a wonderful documentary, by the way, which is easily available to anybody now on YouTube. It's called I.F. Stone's Weekly. And when it came out in 1973, Vincent Canby chose it as one of the 10 best films of the year. It's a little 65-minute black and white documentary, but everything you want to know about Izzy is in that film, including a very, very, very young me.
Yeah, right. Well, did any of his anti-war fervor rub off on you when you were actually found yourself in Vietnam? Were you an opponent of the war?
That goes to the Bradley question. You said the 3 mentors.
Right.
And I mentioned
I was about to ask you about Bradley.
Ben, Bob, and Izzy, BBS, right? But the amazing thing is, as I reflected on it, that when Ben Bradley called me into his office, I was 26. And he didn't say, you're doing a good job. And he didn't say you're a fine fellow. And he didn't say, what are your politics? He knew I worked for Izzy. He just said, will you go to Vietnam? And I said, of course. Because his standard was, if you go, will you do everything you can to cover the story to our and to the reader's satisfaction? That was his standard. Now, whether that would be the standard today, I don't know. He didn't say, well, let's see now, Peter, what is your draft status? Or let's see, Peter, have you ever joined a demonstration? He didn't ask any of those questions, and maybe he could have, he didn't.
If he had said, had you ever been to a demonstration? What would you have answered?
No. The answer would have been no.
So you were not part of you didn't feel yourself part of that groundswell in the late 60s that was very critical of the war and began sort of anti-establishment, feelings spreading throughout universities and things?
Well, John, I was a little older than that. Remember, I graduated from college. I was a product of the John Kennedy years.
Right.
I started college in 60 and finished in 64. And, curiously, those were a kind of they were misleading. They were the Peace Corps. They were the early civil rights the only demonstration I ever participated in was a civil rights demonstration in Atlantic City. I was there as a volunteer in the Democratic Convention in 64. But I'd been to Mississippi, and I'd met Fannie Lou Hamer, and I met all those folks down there. And when they were not being seated as the Mississippi delegation in the Democratic Convention in 1964, in my little tie and jacket, I went out and stood on the boardwalk next to Stokely Carmichael and shook Martin Luther King's hand. And that was the only demonstration I ever participated in. I was a reporter, and I just somehow knew that a reporter doesn't, but I don't know whether that would be appropriate today. Whether Brad, if he called me in today, would have said, well, Peter, we need to know. It just wouldn't occur to him. It just wasn't his thing.
Right.
What you do as a reporter, and if you got it right, he was definitely on your side, which is one of the reasons why he was such a successful editor.
Yeah. You mentioned this trip down south in, I think it was 1962.
Right.
It strikes me as incredible. You were still a student at Brandeis. You were writing for the Brandeis newspaper, and you went down there and you met Fannie Lou Hamer, James Meredith, and even had lunch with William Faulkner. Dinner, even better. How did that come about?
Well, there was a man at Brandeis named William Higgs, who was a fellow, Lasker fellow, and one of the only sort of white lawyers in Mississippi, graduate of Harvard Law School, and one of the very, very few lawyers at that time who would represent civil rights cases. And for some reason, and I cannot remember why exactly, he asked me and two other fellows to go with him to Mississippi in, what was it, middle of the year, kind of intercession, 10 days. We drove down. And this was, in a sense, just before the civil rights movement really came to fruition. And so it was an amazing 10 days because we were able to meet everybody and see everything. And, I was a young man from New York. I was stunned by what I saw in Mississippi and the level of the degree of poverty. And there is a funny journalistic story. I met James Meredith. And I said to Mr. Meredith, who was applying to go to Ole Miss and was going to go in the following fall, listen, I said, Jim, why don't you write me a letter about why you want to go to Ole Miss? And he did. And the following fall, in October, whenever it was when he enrolled, we had in the little Brandeis newspaper, world exclusive, James Meredith on why I want to go to Ole Miss. And if you go deeply into the morgue of the New York Times, the first clip with my name in it is a clip from AP pickup that the Brandeis Justice had an exclusive with James Meredith. And I guess, when something like that happens, you've been to Mississippi, you had this little bit of business, you say, well, journalism is in fact something I'd like to do.
Yeah. You mentioned Bob Bernstein now. Let's go to the years of publishing. How do you begin at the age, I guess you were in your 40s, in a
40.
totally new profession? And I think you once said something like you applied some of the same tools you had learned as a journalist in the world of publishing. What did you mean when it comes to McNamara, for example? What journalistic tool would you use to get a good book out of him?
Well, the first thing is
I'm
that
talking about Robert McNamara. Everyone knows, former Secretary of Defense, presided over the war in Vietnam.
Well, very simple explanation of why I was able to do it at Random House is I didn't know what I wasn't supposed to do, so I did everything. And until somebody told me to stop. When I complained about some small piece of bureaucracy, Bernstein looked at me without a smile and he said, Peter, keep your eye on the books. If the books work, everything will be fine. If the books don't work, nothing will save you. It was really good advice. And that's what I did. I sort of kept my blinders on what the books were. McNamara came along, I'd been there a while already, probably 10 years, and he wanted to write his full autobiography. And we acquired the book. And since I had sort of slightly knew McNamara from Washington, and that was my specialty and so on, so I became the editor. And I said, Bob, look, people mostly want to know what you have to say about Vietnam. So forget, dwelling on your childhood and when you were the president of the Ford Motor Company and so on. Write the Vietnam piece first. And he went away and came back with 100,000 words. And we then spent 18 months working on those words. I have the transcripts, I have the tapes. What they were a very, very sustained exercise. He had a young historian who was his researcher. I had a young editor who was working with me, talking him through. And on one of the very last sessions, the subject was the mall on the Vietnam Memorial on the mall. And he kind of just blurted, he said, look, the war was wrong, terribly wrong. We owe it to future generations to explain why. And I said, that's the book. And it was, in essence. When the book was published, it was hugely controversial. The New York Times said that, in effect, Robert McNamara should not have a restful night of sleep after what he did and the fact that he didn't say what he knew for 25 years. And it was very, very, very contentious.
Yeah, what was his reaction to the
McNamara?
controversy?
Well, yeah, I thought there was one particularly bad night at Harvard where he was harangued by a Vietnam vet in a crowded meeting, and he finally blurted, shut up. And I thought that was going to be the end, that he would come to me the next day and say, Peter, this is just beyond me. I just, no. In fact, the next morning he came, knocked on my door and said, no, I've got to do this. I know why they're angry, but I've got to do this.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And here's a very small little additional anecdote. Remember David Harris, who was one of the great anti-war protesters of the 60s, president of the Stanford student body, married Joan Baez, went to jail for a year, because he burned his draft card or whatever. And we sent him to Vietnam in the 90s to find out what it was in this place that he so devoted his life to. And McNamara and David Harris happened to be in the office on the same day. And of course, I was responsible for both books. So I introduced them. McNamara's book was finished, and he gave a copy to David Harris. And I wrote David Harris and said, well, what did he say? And he said, he wrote, to David Harris, with admiration, Robert McNamara. And Harris said, I was stunned then, and I'm still stunned.
Yeah.
Later, Errol Morris did the film, The Fog of War. And I like to say, or I choose to say, that Bob was never forgiven, but at least he was understood.
Yeah.
United States went into Vietnam not knowing what we were doing, and we failed miserably. And it's a lesson we did not really learn.
Yeah, yeah. Of course, you've done now books with 4 presidents, Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump. Could you give me, in each case, a brief summary of something surprising that struck you from each one, beginning with Jimmy Carter?
Well, I don't think it's surprising if they, as much as they are revealing. I mean, the thing about Carter was his extraordinary, really, truly extraordinary authenticity when you got up close to him. I mean, I sat in his kitchen with he and Rosalind holding hands, saying grace. He in fact wrote all the books himself. I did a ridiculous book of children's book that he did with Amy. I did a book of his poetry, which was actually not bad. But I mean, I don't know if it was bad because I don't know anything about poetry, but I published it and it worked. It was a significant bestseller for 7 weeks. So Jimmy was authentic.
All right, Clinton?
Bill was charismatic and wrestling a book out of him. We did his sort of so-called secret 1996 book during the campaign. And we finally got it done. But getting Bill to focus was very difficult. And when he went on C-SPAN, Brian Lamb said, "So why didn't the book do better?" And Bill said, "Well, I didn't really have time to promote it." And so I wrote to him and said, "You're the first author in history who didn't say it was the publisher's fault." The truth is, the book wasn't very good, and Bill was distracted. Barack came to me after his book had been rejected by Simon & Schuster because he missed his deadline. Can you believe that? And we published it in 1995. It's a good book, Dreams from My Father, sold modestly. 9 years later, he gave the keynote speech to the Democratic Convention. The same book, dusted off, sold 4 million copies. And Trump, again, I've been asked 1,000 times about how do you feel in my campaign? Well, I've been in Random House a very short time, and the owner, Mr. Newhouse, decided he wanted to do a book with Trump, and it was very unusual for Newhouse to want to do a book like that. I was, quote, tasked. And I went to see Trump with Cy. He was so flattered that Cy wanted to, remember Cy was Roy Cohn's best friend. That's, Roy Cohn's house.
That was the connection, probably.
And I'm sitting there, and next thing I know, there's a contract, no agent, no lawyer, and a writer named Tony Schwartz who already wanted to do the book. We published a book called The Art of the Deal, and it sold 1 million copies in the first 3 months. I once saw him in a wrestling arena in Atlantic City a year or two later, before The Apprentice. 18,000 people, the kind of people who would go to Atlantic City wrestling. When Trump comes in the arena, they cheer, they roar. So when he became a major candidate in 2015, whereas an awful lot of other people say, this is a joke, it can't be taken seriously, I was uneasy because I believed that what we saw in Donald Trump in the mid-'80s or late '80s, it was his hold on the kind of people who would go to professional wrestling in Atlantic City. Turns out there were a lot of them.
Yeah.
And so I think the biggest political mistake of modern American history was underestimating Trump when he ran for president and believing that somehow he would turn out not to be what he was. He was what he was. I saw him as a young man, but then he was a developer.
Yeah.
Later,
By the way, we're about halfway through. So if any of our listeners and watchers want to pose a question, just do it on chat. Some have been coming up, but I find I can't see the entire question. So Patricia, if you or Chad or someone else wants to read out a question that strikes you as a good one, by all means do it. I'd like to just continue with the Trump business for a while, because in effect, that book, The Art of the Deal, not only launched him, but sort of created him. I mean, Tony Schwartz built I think, largely fictional picture of a master businessman, et cetera, that captured, I guess, an element of truth, which he's got a kind of primal ability to make some people do what he wants them to do. Tony Schwartz is, filled with mea culpas over this. Do you think, in retrospect, that book was kind of a mistake?
Well, first of all, I disagree with the fact that it was fiction.
I mean, the persona, the character.
Tony, you have to distinguish with the fact that Tony did a much better job than he now is comfortable recognizing. Meaning, he really did capture the essence of what Donald Trump wanted to be and was. I don't do it for the money, I do it to do it. Well, that's baloney. But the fact is, the stories he tells in the book are all real stories. There's nothing in there that's fiction. He built Trump Tower. The New York Times, a newspaper with which you are familiar, its first story about Donald Trump said he looks a little like Robert Redford.
Yeah, I remember that.
When Cy Newhouse had GQ put him on the cover, it sold like crazy. So here's the thing about Trump. Donald Trump was, when I saw him, much more, very young, but he was the same person he was when he became president. Lived over the store, whether it was Trump Tower or the White House. Didn't smoke, didn't drink, never went anywhere without his name on it, really in the end, except for political rallies. And in the end, only really cared about himself, truly only cared about himself, not really, truly only cared about himself. But was a developer in New York, that's one thing. But 40 years later, 30 years later, when he's the president of the United States, remember, who thought up all those terrible nicknames? Trump does. Trump thrived on a kind of sinister instinct that, it is not wrong to compare him to people of the past who had that capacity to connect in a way that's ultimately sinister, but mustn't be misunderstood as phony. It's real in his connection to people. That's the man who he was. And as I said, when he ran and people said it's a joke, and besides that, we don't like Hillary, that's how we got Trump.
Right.
We got Trump because we didn't take Trump as seriously as we should have. And we didn't like Hillary. And we got Donald Trump. And what you saw was Donald Trump, same fella, but now on steroids.
Got it. We are having
Could I interrupt
questions
one
come
second,
in.
John? Yeah,
Yeah,
a couple of the questions.
yeah. I think you're freezing up.
So
but-
I could ask them, I okay.
I see them here. Here's one that says, do you think your journalism experience helped you to be a good editor? You seem to have been a very hands-on editor.
Depends on your definition of editor. People think, editor, like sculptor or doctor, is, can be defined in many ways. I always thought that my editing skill, such as it wasn't hooking the graphs and changing the adjectives. It was getting the story, because that's where I was as a reporter and as a journalist. My goal was to get the story, whether it was Robert McNamara or any of the other people, Vernon Jordan, any of the other people I worked with. I was determined to get the story, which is why, as a very hands-on editor, what I did was, when I was with these personalities and working with, usually they would have somebody working with them. Jimmy Carter did not, but others did. Barack did not. What you come to understand is how to get beyond the words on the page to what's really going on. And that's what a reporter wants to do. And that's what I did as an editor. And somebody like Vernon Jordan, I sat with him in our office. His co-author, Annette Gordon-Reed, who later went on to great fame as herself a writer and professor, and the editor. And we worked with Vernon to get beyond the facts of his story to the feeling and essence of his story. Remind very quickly, the book was called Vernon Can Read. And it was, Vernon Can Read is what his boss, an old banker in Atlanta, said one day when Vernon was working as a summer driver, found Vernon in the library looking at a book, and he said, "My God," he said to people at dinner, "Vernon can read." And that was the title of the book. And that was the story Vernon wanted to tell. And it wasn't the story of, I did this and I did that and Bill Clinton and so on. It was the story of how Vernon Jordan, young man from Atlanta, ended up being, as Henry Louis Gates says, he was to blacks in major business what Rosa Parks was to buses. That was Vernon. And in order to get the story, you had to become a partner. And again, one of the privileges for me was, since I wasn't an employee and I was the editor and so-called responsible for the book, they had to kind of take me seriously. I want to go to Tony Schwartz for 1 second. Tony Schwartz regrets the fact that he was, and this is a harsh term, but a real term, he was the collaborator. He got credit on the cover. He got 50% of the proceeds of the book. Of course, when he looks back on that and realizes what the consequences were of that, of course he has regrets. I can feel, and I really believe, that I was there watching, and I became, in effect, the publisher of the book and learned how to deal with somebody like Trump in publishing.
Right, right.
And
Right.
this Random House who gave him the money, I never gave him a penny, and he never gave me a penny. So it's even
Got
Steven.
it. Another question, this from William Holstein says, flash forward to today, sir. What do you think about the state of the modern correspondent? And what about the book publishing industry?
Well, on book publishing, I think it's really great and continuing to be a surprising story. I say that the first book in print was Gutenberg's Bible, and the second book was called Publishing is Dead. People have been saying, oh my God, no one's going to read, no one's going to do this. Look, through the pandemic, books did fine. For this audience, for this group, one thing you have to remember is books never had advertising. So we didn't lose it. For us, it was always about engaging with people who wanted to read the book and pay for it. So the thing that is now common in journalism, which is let's get readers into subscribers, it was always our reality. So books have done well. Think about this. The euphemism, the phrase I use is good books any way you want them now. Meaning, today, if you, John, or Patricia, or anybody else wants a book, you can choose to have it in print, digital, audio. If you want it in print, you have to ask for it. If you want it in digital, you download it. And if you want it in audio, you download it right away. That changes the equation of how people access books. It's not, I'll see if I can get John's book. I can. That's on. As far as correspondence, I think that, look, I think, in the New York Times bureau chief in London in the 60s had a chauffeur, and a Bentley. I can pretty much guarantee that's not the case today. I think journalism's, correspondent is no longer the significant representative of an enterprise with, spending money on it. They and her. I think you have to really hustle. But the truth is that there are an awful lot of really good reporters out there.
Yeah. Well, here's another question from a very well-known reporter and known to both of us as a friend, Craig Whitney, who says, what's your view on the changes in journalism in our country since you were a reporter? Too much opinion now, too little then? Izzy Stone is one thing. Ben Bradley's Washington Post was quite another, and there was room for both. Is that still true today with Fox News, CNN, Washington Post, New York Times, everybody else?
Well, I think, Whitney has a distinguished record. I have to hasten to add that he and I were in Vietnam together, and another one of my good long-term friends. So I want to say that the truth is that American journalism in this country, the idea that the beau ideal of journalism, thoughtful, objective, deeply reported, is great, but it isn't really the story of American journalism. There's an awful lot of nonsense in American journalism. You think about the Hearsts and the McCormicks and all kinds of stuff. That's been around. What's different now, and what I think is really at the core of what's agreed as a problem, is the megaphone. When the Chicago Tribune basically instigated a war in Cuba, it was, relatively narrow focus on the audience. And we now know that you can say something and it explodes. The degree to which everything is available instantly and to everybody is an enormous change. And I think that, remember, we're still at the very early ages of trying to understand the full impact of whatever you call it, social media. But I think to some extent, we really need to figure it out and understand it. But, the same thing happened when television came along. Television came along, and in the space of 10 years, television was a dominant means of communications in this country. And what fascinates me is that right now, if you talk to younger people, for a great many of them, their most popular form of getting information are podcasts. Well, what is podcast? Podcast is radio. Podcast is the most old-fashioned way of broadcast communications, and yet it has a resilience. So what I'm saying is some of what we're seeing now is historic in the American culture. Some of it is the consistency of storytelling and news. And some of it is the current means of distribution, which is so pervasive, it's so in your face. And finally, we are all now, every one of us is editor-in-chief. It's no longer the fact that you are given, you are now taking. You choose what the information is that you want. And by sitting in front of one of these screens, you can get anything you want. And that's new, and that's different. And what we still don't really understand is how impactful that is and how insidious, and whether in the long term it really does undermine the culture and democracy and all the things we worry about.
Yeah, well, you mentioned the beau ideal of journalism. Yes, there is a history of yellow journalism, but that goes farther back. And I think you have to recognize that, for about 40 to 60 years, we really had a kind of golden period in which major newspapers tried very hard to be more or less neutral or objective. Do you think that's now deteriorating? Do you see opinion seeping into the news columns of the New York Times and other publications?
I think you have to see that, again, journalism is, as I said, like medicine. It has many specialties. The New York Times, the Washington Post, and so forth, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, they're one facet of journalism, one specialty, one audience. The real danger, and I think it's no longer questionable, it's a fact. The real danger is what's happened to journalism on the lower population levels. We spend our summers in Southwest Michigan. And last summer, I spent the summer tracking a congressional race in our congressional district. And what I discovered, really looking at it very hard, was how very little information the average voter could get. Because the local newspapers, such as they were, the Herald Palladium and St. Joe, is a billboard. The so-called debate was on a radio station in Kalamazoo. And people were making decisions and judgments about who they were going to vote for on really, really, really primitive information. Mm-hmm. And I think that what we've got to figure out is how to reinvent the local news model. And that sounds virtuous, but it's absolutely essential, because most people do not read the New York Times. The nightly viewership of Fox is a few million people. Its resonance is far beyond the few million people. But for a great many people in this country, where do you turn to get the kind of news you need to manage your life? If you asked people in Southwestern Michigan all summer, so I never asked them who they were going to vote for, because that would end the conversation. But what do you really care about? What's on your mind? Healthcare. My father, he's busted, his knees are gone. My mother's a cancer survivor, and I'm terrified that I'm not going to be able to afford the medical care that my parents need. Mm-hmm. That's a big deal. And I think that if I had to, if I was in a position to do something about it, I think I would make my number one priority, not changing the New York Times. It is what it is. And you know what? Life wouldn't be fun if we couldn't complain about the New York Times. And the Washington Post was saved, everybody would agree, by Jeff Bezos, who it turns out doesn't pay taxes, right? So what really matters on the ground, seems to me, is what folks know about what their lives are like. What does it mean to them when a hospital closes? What does it mean to them when the schools are underfunded? And how do we go about making sure, in the digital age, in the internet age, in the age in which printed journalism is less and less significant, how do we reach people with the news they really need to have? Mm-hmm. And that is, if I wasn't at this somewhat advanced stage of life and times, I think that would be my goal, was to figure that one out. And I know that I believe, because I do believe, that we will. Because as a society, we do reinvent. And I do believe that we will find a new way to do journalism. Remember, it used to be, Catherine Graham said about the Washington Post, that it was Woodward and Bernstein. Yes, but it was Woodward and Lothrop, the department store.
Right.
And then Woodward and Lothrop, the department store, went away. So we're having to figure out how to sustain journalism without, quote, Woodward and Lothrop. And that's a process, and I hope it will work. And over time, I believe it will.
Here's another one from Edward Hershey, who is a member of the George Polk jury. And he says, McNamara is sometimes cited as an example of JFK's notion of finding the best and brightest to run the country. Was that naive, arrogant, reasonable?
It was a reflection of who we were at that time. Remember that this was the period after World War II. We had won the war. Korea somehow never really resonated in this country as an issue of true consequence. Dwight Eisenhower became the president for 8 years. We were people who were satisfied with, to some extent, with our transcendent ability to lead. And we were also ignorant. And, the Pentagon Papers, when it came out, it wasn't that it was top secret material. No, what it was is and by the way, it was McNamara who commissioned the Pentagon Papers. What it was, it showed just how extraordinarily ignorant we were, how little we knew about Vietnam, the arrogance of our sense that we could solve any problem was profound because we thought we could. And remember, and here's another thing, all the best and brightest, what did they have in common? They were all men. And they were all men of a certain age, a certain style. And one of the things I know about people like Bob McNamara, George Bundy, when they had a problem, what they tend to do is have 2 drinks, and move on. Opening your soul and heart for these guys was not natural.
Here's a question from Tim Ferguson. Could you address the editing standards in book publishing today? Does it depend on the house? And I'd like to add to that, the industry has seen a number of kind of shakeups and even scandals with books being commissioned to great criticism from the staff within the publishing house, and sometimes books being pulped. Is there a kind of a danger, do you think, from the ranks of the politically correct? Or on the opposite, is that just a long time coming and much needed rectification of the kind of white male publisher that's been on top of the houses for so long?
Well, let me just say that that's a complicated, I don't want to over summarize, but I will give you my personal principles when it comes to these sort of political books. Most recently, Dana Kennedy, the new publisher of Simon & Schuster, who came from the Pulitzer Committee in the New York Times, is African-American, is now the publisher of Simon & Schuster. And it was she, as I understand it, who authorized giving Mike Pence a great deal of money for his vice presidential memoir. So I'm not passing judgment on that. That was what she did. But what would I do? What I would do and what I did was, if somebody came to me of that stature or that inclination, I'd say that there are 2 things that are my personal requirements. One, that your book has to meet the same standards of credibility, veracity, and tone as any other book I publish. I'm not going to publish a book which is just screed, and which I cannot feel as a publisher any confidence in, or sufficient confidence. That's the first rule. And the second principle I would apply is, I will give you every penny that you earn from royalties, meaning every copy that's sold, an author gets royalties. But what I won't do is throw $1 million at you just to have the pleasure of publishing your book. Now, you would say that that's naive because it's a market. And if I won't give them any money, somebody else will. Well, that's not my problem. My problem is to do what I believe is the right thing to do, which is publish books as long as they're credible, as long as they have quality, and to give the authors what they have earned and not give them a gift, a guarantee, a present up front to see what you're going to get. But that's, the reason for saying all this, John, and anybody else, is that I could do that because the creation of my little publishing company was built around that premise.
Yes.
That we're never going to take a risk that we don't want to take. Therefore, we're never going to be Random House. We're going to be public affairs. And that was 25 years ago. And we still are.
Mm-hmm. This is from Minky Warden. Says, congratulations on the book, Peter. And then my question is, what are your views on the state of global press freedom, the proliferation of state-controlled media like RT and the Global Times in China, journalist killings like Jamal Khashoggi, and the recent Belarus plane kidnapping? Are the bad guys winning?
Well, it's always going to be a bad guy, struggle with the bad guys. One of the, again, kind of slightly naive consequences of the so-called end of the Cold War is that we thought all those countries that we had beaten would turn out to be like us. It turns out that's not the case. What we now know is that the Soviet Union kept a cork in the bottle on nationalism for 75 years, the length of its tenure as USSR. And once the cork came out of the bottle, you have Armenia and Georgia and Uzbekistan and Tajikistan and Belarusia and all these, and very few of them have evolved into anything that like we would like them to be. It's just a fact. Poland and Hungary have both reverted to their very traditional nativism, except that in Poland, it's really a divided country. And remember, John, you know this better than most. During the Cold War, it was the Catholic Church that represented the opposition. It was what gave people a sense that we have our voice. And now the Catholic Church is very much part of the official establishment of the right wing in Poland. Hungary is a tragic fact of the reality of a person who I would put in the same bucket with old DJT, Trump, is somebody who has a force of personality and character and gets away with it. And we have to see whether someday Hungary will revert. What do I think about the general state of the world? I think that it'll always be a struggle. And it's one of the reasons why I think journalism is so important and why Minky's been working for Human Rights Watch for years. There are places and people who need to speak up and speak out. And if you do it and believe in it, it's a never-ending battle, but it won't necessarily be lost.
Right. Here's a question from Alan Dodds. Frank, if you can answer this one, I think you've got a news story on your hands. It says, what is Trump's real deal with Russia?
Well, I don't know the answer to that.
But what are your feelings in
my
general?
Feelings, look, I have I think that if you want to know what I think was the real problem of the Mueller investigation, and it's a criticism of journalism also, was calling it collusion. Collusion, a signed piece of paper saying we're going to do this together. No, it was in very clear cooperation, same motives. Trump and Putin share very much the same view of what they want to get away with. I say you take communism out of Russia, which they did, but you can't take Russians out of Russia. And what you've seen in the Putin era is very much classic Russian behavior. And I think that, yes, Trump took a lot of money from them, but I don't think it was ever well, we'll see. I don't think it was ever explicit that Trump was working for the Russians. And let me say this, the Mueller probe went on for a long time, made a lot of people famous with their books and their TV contracts, and everybody had a voice. And then in the end, the thing kind of collapsed. And I said, I wouldn't want to be the publisher of a lot of extraneous copies of Mueller probe books, because it came and it went without resolution. What was Trump's hold? What was Putin's hold on? I think it was more character and personality. I think it would be almost impossible for me to conceive that there's a piece of paper that would prove that Donald Trump was working for Putin. Is that an answer that's sufficient for this?
I think so. We have time for one last question, and I'd like to ask it myself. I think in the preface, or in an early part of the book, you mused about the question of, would you find something about yourself at the end of this long trail of research? You went to Cambodia, you went to Poland, you went to India, you interviewed people who knew you way back when, you looked at records in the Washington Post and everywhere. Did you, in fact, discover something about yourself that you hadn't known before you began this kind of long trip?
I think I'll go back to the question of deflection, that I did not appreciate really that throughout my life, what was happening around me was not necessarily what I was reacting to. That an awful lot of what I kind of absorbed and felt wasn't immediately apparent. I say this, that my brother from the years 8 to 12 had the most extraordinary and most phenomenally terrifying experience a child could have. Nazi Poland, escaping, living in India as a child and being sent away to school. And yet, the rest of his life was not overwhelmed by that fact. I don't know exactly what it was. I have a feeling that as I discovered that I really wasn't aware of what my emotions were, and that I would somehow park them. And as a result, there were ways in which, because I didn't appreciate the real nature of what was happening around me, that it was possible for me to miss the point. Mm-hmm. And I think that's something that anyone who's a journalist of a certain kind should understand.
And you deal with this in a late chapter in the book called Wrinkles,
right?
In which you say you went through a difficult patch. And I wonder if you relate some of that to the deflection and to
I don't think there's any
not
question.
Analyzing what you're going through as you're going through it, not your feelings and your reactions.
Yes, John, as you know, to put it very simply, when you go to see a therapist and the therapist says, how were you treated as a child? That's one issue. But if the therapist says, what's going on now? And if there are several things going on in everybody's life, because it's just a fact, that are stressful, and you don't really know the degree to which they are stressing you, mm-hmm. Your emotions are going to go somewhere. And you might call it depression. I did. But what it really was an awareness of things happening over which I didn't have control. Things that involved, personal things, all of which I have to say mercifully have been resolved. But when it was happening, I didn't know how deeply I felt it, mm-hmm. because that was not my style. And if I had been helped to probe, and eventually I was, obviously, what's going on now? You're under stress. Stress is inevitable. Stress is not an illness. It's a fact. And if you can manage stress, meaning if you know that the things that are going on are stressful and appreciate them, the odds of your having the kind of crisis that in the end I pretty much had, not because I was unable to deal with it, it's because I didn't understand what was really wrong. And I think that's, of all the messages in the book, wrinkles is to me one of the most important, which is everybody's going to have to deal with it. You're just not going to get away without having to deal with it. And recognizing the degree to which it's inevitable is an essential path towards getting through it.
All right, great. I think we've probably run out of time. Is that right, Patricia?
Yes, and I think that was a perfect ending note. And I thank both of you for a really moving and fascinating conversation of so many topics. And so it's a pleasure to have such two wise men deal with present tonight. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. John,
Thanks for inviting us.
you beat me up. Thank you.